Good day. Our topic is actively engaging students in doing math is essential for developing mathematical proficiency. My name is Ellen Edmonds, and I am the Executive Director of Professional Development for Sadlier School. I'm really excited to be talking with you today. We're going to spend some time talking about mathematics, a content area I really love, and thinking a little differently about math. We're going to talk about developing mathematical proficiency. We're going to talk about engaging versus doing. We'll spend a little time on high impact math instructional strategies. And we'll look at some stories from a school's perspective, a couple of schools that I've spent some time in. And we'll also talk about manipulatives and the use of pictorial representations. Again, we'll visit a school through my recollection. And finally, we'll talk about the role of assessment in all of this. I know that you know this, but I think review is always good for us. We've been making for over a decade shifts in our mathematical instruction. We're shifting in part because the world is shifting, and the world does, although in a very slow way, impact what we do in our classrooms. And we as educators have to think about how to best prepare the children in our classrooms for the jobs that will be available in their futures. And if you've been with me before, you've heard me talk about the fact that we don't, as individuals, have to spend our time computing anymore. I think it became very clear to us when we watched the movie Hidden Figures, if you watched it, that those individuals who did that high level computing had their jobs replaced by technology. Computers now are able to do that. They're able to do those computations that were the focus of our math education in the past. What we're called upon to do in the present working world is to be able to interpret complex data, to be able to design algorithms to make predictions, to be able to use what we have learned about mathematics to solve new problems in lots of different ways, and not just mathematical problems, real world problems. Of course, the children who are in classrooms today are going to face an even greater difference in the world. And we want to build their capabilities so that when in the future they walk into a working world, they're able to take on those careers that are available to them. And we know that those careers, at the very least, will be knowledge based, unlike the careers of the past, which were skill based. So they're going to have to know how to access and evaluate and use information. And that, in fact, is a really big part of mathematics literacy. And it's really where we're shifting our instruction. We've got lots of new ways to think and talk about math too. Part of the reason we taught math for so long the way we did is that we were really constricted by the tools we had available. We had paper, we had pencils, we didn't have a lot at our fingertips. But now with technology, we're able to demonstrate things, to represent things in ways that our parents and our grandparents, and if you're as ancient as I am, that I was unable to do. So we need to give our students understanding, deep conceptual understanding that's quite a bit different from what was required for me when I was in the classroom. And so the level of mathematics that we need for intelligent citizenship has really increased in a way that's even hard to comprehend. And our students need it to be able to think mathematically and to problem solve. And that's a requirement not just for our high flying students, but for every student in our classroom. So we have some really significant needs in terms of the real world, but it's also the case that unlike the past when our ability to read was the gatekeeper in terms of our educational opportunities, now it's our ability to be successful in higher level math that becomes the gatekeeper, particularly when it comes to higher education. So our students, in order to have the world open to them, both in terms of careers, but also in terms of the academic opportunities available to them, need to be able to deeply understand math. So, what does that mean? It means that our students in our classroom need to be able to construct to their own understandings, to apply their prior knowledge and skills, to be consistently challenged, to be open to taking risks and making mistakes, and to see math as purposeful and meaningful. That means, again, that we have to shift the way we teach. Those shifts have to be supportive of students' development of mathematical proficiency. And mathematical proficiency is no longer about a monolithic view of computation. We now need students who have strategic competence, who are capable to engage in adaptive reasoning, who have deep conceptual understanding, who have a productive disposition towards math, and they need to have procedural fluency, which is not just being able to compute accurately, but also efficiently and appropriately be able to carry out procedures. And that is really our goal as educators in the classroom, is to develop students' mathematical proficiency. We know from an abundance of research that there are some really great strategies for making sure that our students are successful in their math education. And we certainly want to put those strategies in play in our classrooms. And I imagine that you absolutely have done that. It's interesting to see that data reflected in the schools in varied states. So we know that it's a consistent expectation that we should have for ourselves in terms of what our classroom activities and practices should look like. We want to have a high level of student engagement. Learning math cannot be passive. Students have to be actively involved, and they need to engage in tasks and problem solving that require higher order thinking. Our students need to be supported by a model of instruction that includes collaboration and direct instruction and the use of concrete and virtual manipulatives. We have to connect our students' understanding of math, their prior knowledge, to be able to help them make meaningful connections to the real world. Those application opportunities that are real world application opportunities help students see the relevance of math and develop productive dispositions towards math. And literacy, of course, has to be integrated into what we do. It's interesting to see how many of the problems, word problems that students have to solve are challenging for them because they don't have academic vocabulary, they don't have math vocabulary, and they don't have the content-based reading strategies that will help them understand those problems. For instance, they're not using their close reading experiences to support them. And then, as a backdrop to all of that, we have to make sure that our classrooms are safe places where students feel comfortable making presentations, answering questions, trying things, making mistakes. We need to have our classrooms be neutral in those ways, and really make sure that students are not ostracized or bullied, or in any way feel uncomfortable with taking those risks. So we know we have some big responsibilities. And I think it's really important for us to remember that with mathematics, our first job is really to make sure that our students fall in love with math. Productive dispositions really are critical to success in math. And that means we too have to be excited about teaching math and engaged at a very high level. And students have to be actively involved. So we play a really critical role in that. Now, when I was thinking about the title for this particular presentation, I wanted to get across the point that active engagement was essential for student success. And I wanted everyone to recognize that that shift that we've been working on, those shifts that we've been working on for so long, haven't gotten us to the right place quite yet. And I wanted to make sure that it was clear we weren't talking about focusing on answer getting anymore, but really focusing on problem solving at the hub of what we would do instructionally. Having students who are equipped to be great problem solvers, to use the repertoire of strategies they have, to have a good process for problem solving, to be equipped to look at problems and to be able to solve them in multiple ways, and expect that there can be more than one answer. So students need to understand the math, not just do the math. And so when I'm thinking about doing, I'm not thinking about doing in the sense of rote approach, memorization approach. I am really talking about a high level of active engagement. So I'm thinking about cognitive engagement. I'm thinking about operative engagement and affective engagement. I'm thinking about students who are truly involved in the learning process and owning the learning of mathematics, making the investment, taking the effort that's necessary for success, and recognizing that frustration is a part of that process, recognizing that persistence is absolutely critical. And when students are actively engaged, when they are talking about math, writing about math, able to model mathematical situations, when they're involved actively and it is not the teacher owning all the learning, and the students passively opening their brains and taking in information, when they are thinking and exploring, trying things out and taking risks, we see significant success. And of course, that doesn't surprise us. I think we understand that the least effective instructional approach that we can take is lecturing. We know that true learning happens the more involved students are, all the way to the point of them being able to teach someone themselves. And we're looking for not just busy work. When I'm talking about engagement, I really am talking about deep involvement in that task, deep problem solving, true discourse and collaboration, a give and take, and a level of engagement that produces strong outcomes. And that also means that I am making sure students see that they're going to use this math when they're living their daily lives and in their future careers. And it means that students do understand, again, I'm going to say this, that learning requires hard work, but there's a big payoff when that effort is made because accomplishments happen. And so that level of student engagement, that multidimensional construct that I have described, is something that is a paired level of engagement with students being involved in that way and teachers being involved in that way. I know that you know, whatever we're doing, that idea of do what I say, not what I do doesn't work. And so when we're thinking about teaching mathematics, we have a powerful influence on our students. We, as educators, have the greatest impact on student outcomes. And so it's really important that our instruction be designed in such a way that it hooks our students, so that they are productive and they are active and they are engaged in discourse in a way that will result in the outcomes that we all know are critical. And that means, of course, that we have to understand the math we're teaching. We have to get those concepts. And sometimes that means some work and studying on our part. We have to be fully invested in that teaching. It certainly helps if we are able to collaborate with our peers. We are able to plan with our peers. That's not always possible. But now with social media and learning communities, we have the opportunity to collaborate with peers in a very meaningful way. And that in turn allows us to support our students in that same level of collaboration and active engagement. And you'll see a huge difference with your students when you're able to do that. So that idea of thinking hard and working hard and feeling good applies to students. It also applies to teachers and teaching mathematics. So our level of engagement in all of those dimensions is as important as it is for our students. So we have to shift our instruction. And for some of you, that may mean that you're just making some minor adjustments at this point. Some of you are still having to make those really major shifts away from that idea of lecturing and only whole class instruction to a lot of guided instruction, guided practice, small group work, paired work, a lot of discourse in our classrooms, and a lot of support for recognizing that the first time we are exposed to something, we won't necessarily master that concept, but that proficiency develops over time and takes a tremendous amount of work and effort. And we provide opportunities for that so that our students will be more successful. If we're an engaged teacher, we know that there are many levels on which we have to be engaged and in which we have to plan. So I've provided an opportunity for you to reflect a little bit on your role as a teacher in a mathematics classroom. I've provided a tool for you to use to think about your engagement in terms of curriculum, in terms of planning, in terms of assessment, using different grouping strategies, using technology, and engaging in your own professional learning. I'm going to pause for a minute and let you get access to that document, and you may not complete it now, but you might start thinking about that and thinking about the implications for your own practice. Okay, I hope that you are able to zero in on something that you want to really focus on changing in the next few weeks, or that you feel like what I've done is affirmed what you are doing in your classroom. And maybe that inspires you to share with a peer, or to talk a bit more about it. I've been delighted to have the last few years of my work as an educator, and I should say more than a few, honestly. Um, I have the honor of being in classrooms and working with teachers on a regular basis. And I recognize that just as when I taught, I could always improve what I did. There, are no perfect classrooms. We can learn so much by being able to glimpse at what happens in other classrooms. And unfortunately, as educators, we rarely get that opportunity. I sometimes tell people I'm a teaching nerd because I watch the videos on the teaching channel, but it certainly gives me an opportunity to see lots of classrooms and the inner workings of those classrooms. When I was an administrator, I had the opportunity to observe in classrooms. But when I really wanted it, when it was so critical to me, I was teaching every day and I couldn't go next door to see what my peer was doing or to another school to get a glimpse into the innovative things that were happening there. So I think just by sharing some observations, it may help you think about some things in a less theoretical way. So I noticed in some of the Catholic school classrooms that I visited in Pennsylvania that there were some consistent practices that made a difference. And one of the things that I saw happen on a regular basis was beginning the lesson by asking students to engage in looking at a really challenging problem or task that had a real world context. And there was generally some large group discussion, and then students would very quickly, in the most organized way imaginable, slip into pairs or small groups to really dig into that task and to do some group work and problem solving. And students gained so much from that conversation with each other. You would see them explaining how they solved the problem. You would see them making some conjectures, and they might justify their answer. They might explain the process they used. Sometimes there would be some gentle arguments about things, always respectful, and always open to hearing different ways of approaching solving problems. And the teachers would be moving from group to group, not engaging in the sense of taking over the learning, sometimes asking a question as a way of moving the discussion forward or getting more insight into the thinking of the students in the classroom. And the teachers were also very clearly listening and thinking about when that exercise was completed, having students share in a way that would benefit everyone. So teachers were facilitating and really making great observations. And so the teacher really played a very critical role no longer in the front of the classroom owning all the learning, but really pushing students thinking. And I heard them asking questions about, like, how do you know, or what makes you think so? Making them extend the thinking, changing values in the problem, and letting them think about it in that way. And I was really impressed with both the physical aspect of the classroom that made transitioning to pairs and small group work so smooth, but also the fact that clearly teachers had established norms in terms of expected behaviors, had modeled processes that they wanted to have used, and students knew those expectations and knew what was to be done and moved quickly forward with those. Someone may be recording, someone may be um, asking particular questions. There were all kinds of roles in the small group work that I would see. And in paired work, there was clear exchange so that one student wasn't dominating. There'd clearly been the established expectation that both students would participate fully. And it was very clear that when students weren't making connections, when there was a common misconception, that the teacher picked up on that and was able to share in the whole group, the whole class, elements of those discussions, or ask students to, so that everyone could learn. And there was never any sense that sharing something that was a mistake was in any way a negative. Teachers did it so beautifully, and students had learned that that was a part of the process. And teachers had students journaling, and it was interesting to watch them refine their ideas in their journals, to see them capturing their work and making adjustments. And I learned so much from those classrooms. And I feel like there were some critical elements of what I learned. I think teachers really made making mistakes okay. And I'm not saying that they encouraged lack of precision. That was not at all what I'm trying to imply, because clearly they expected both precision in terms of language and precision in terms of computations, but rather they clearly embraced the fact that we learn from our mistakes, and that by thinking about our mistakes, we are able to revisit math and to continue the process. And in some cases, they talked about their own mistakes, or they modeled their own mistakes, so that it was clear that mathematicians didn't always get it right the first time. And they really encouraged students to stick with things. They made time for it. Sometimes they had allocated a certain amount of time and it was clear students needed more time. And sometimes a group of the students didn't really understand at the end of the class period. And the teacher made it absolutely clear that that was fine, that we didn't all pick up on things immediately. And sometimes we needed more time with it. And so teachers found great ways to support students in continuing that struggle, and both in very accurate feedback, not the glib kind of atta girl, atta boy things that aren't productive for students. And they also made it really clear that the students needed to own part of that process too. So there was a really open attitude about supporting struggle and then seeing success. And when students bailed, when they quit, teachers were able to notice those behaviors and intervene and very carefully and quickly get students back on track. Sometimes students really were the teachers, and it was very valuable. They learned from their peers. And because the teacher didn't own everything that happened in the classroom, I noticed that actually students were more receptive and listened more to teachers in a way that doesn't happen when the teachers own all of the learning. And it was also the case that students valued the feedback from their peers, and they learned so much in that interaction and that respectful back and forth. And sometimes it meant that someone learned a new process for doing something. Sometimes someone was reminded that they needed to check their own work and be careful and be precise. Sometimes vocabulary was used incorrectly, and someone gently reminded someone about the right vocabulary words, that precision in that was important. And teachers asked lots of questions. They clearly had planned Their questions, they didn't always supply the answers. Sometimes what they did is really acknowledge that the question was a good question, and they would follow that with a question. And so students really learned that the learning was their own and they were responsible, and they needed to take advantage of the resources available to them before they went to the teacher as though the teacher were the receptacle for all knowledge and all answers. And it was interesting how many times teachers framed questions in a way that spurred more thinking, more questioning, more exploration. So students consistently had to dig deeper, think more, explore more, use the resources available to them. And teachers made it meaningful to the students. They were very clear about students making connections. And so problems had been revised to reflect places that were relevant to the area of Pennsylvania that the students lived in. They inserted students' names in place of the names that might have been in the problem. It was interesting to see the use of personalization and what a difference that made for students. And you could see a sense of ownership that happened from that. So the other thing that teachers did beautifully was make sure that all children participated, and the struggling students had a great opportunity to participate in a way so that they weren't always asking the strong students to present, to share what they had thought, to explain, to justify. Every student had that opportunity, and that made a huge difference for all students. So I learned a lot from those classrooms. I've shared a few strategies that I found to be quite powerful as I observed classrooms. And I'd like for you to think about those strategies and select one of the ones I described. If you're already using it, think about what makes it strong in your classroom and how you might enhance it. If it's a strategy that you haven't used, think about how you might incorporate it. Think about why that strategy seemed to be a good one for your classroom and what you would need to change to integrate it into your practices. And obviously, change doesn't happen quickly. So, what might you change first? And I think it always helps us to time frame that. When might you change? When might you make that first change? When would you like to have that new strategy in place? And oh, by the way, is there another one that you would like to incorporate? So I want you to think about this and think about how you might integrate one of these strategies in your classroom. So make a couple notes. I gave you a shared document that you can use. If you don't mind pulling that out, use that as a way of thinking a little bit about this. And while you're making notes, I want you to think about coming back to this concept, this strategy. In a few weeks, check in with yourself. See if you've actually implemented it effectively. And if you have, if it's made a difference in your classroom, the level of student engagement, the kind of outcomes that you're seeing. Now, when we think about engagement and when we think about active involvement in math and problem solving, manipulatives play a really big role. I know sometimes when we move into fourth and fifth grade classrooms, sixth, seventh, eighth grade classrooms, ninth grade classrooms, we put aside manipulatives. We think they're no longer necessary. But it really is important for all of our students to have the opportunity to use manipulatives. And for striving students, it's really critically important. This is really the case with abstract concepts that concrete manipulatives, concrete materials can make a very big difference. When we think about the concrete pictorial abstract approach or concrete representational abstract approach, we know that it increases students' development of deep conceptual understanding. And for some students, that step-by-step path is critically important. For other students, maybe using concrete and then moving directly to the abstract, or pictorial and directly to the abstract is sufficient. But in an iterative process, really providing both concrete and virtual manipulatives makes a big difference for our students and helps them make sense of math. And so we know that it's sometimes challenging to have concrete manipulatives available to every student. I think if we think creatively about it, rather than always having to buy kits for every student, we may be able to make those concrete manipulatives more accessible. But it's also really easy to make virtual manipulatives available to our students, both in the classroom and at home. And so that is a great way of providing that representational or pictorial support for students to really deepen their understanding. And we want to use those tools across the grades. They truly are a bridge for understanding. And it's certainly the case that as we try to prepare students for higher level math, that deep conceptual understanding is important. So pulling out the manipulatives when we introduce a new concept, making that routine a part of what we do in a way that helps students understand the value and not think of them as something that is inappropriate at the grade level. And so it certainly helps students understand abstract concepts. It will lead to students making connections. It helps clarify any misconceptions. They support discourse and collaboration in a very powerful way. And certainly for our striving students and our students with disabilities, they're really, really important. There are some adjustments we can make to virtual manipulatives that may be even more supportive of students who have particular disabilities or language concerns. So thinking about virtual manipulatives in those ways can be really helpful to us. Often we are able to look at the instructional materials we have and either be guided to use manipulatives or clearly see the connection. Even when that's not the case, thinking about beginning with manipulatives will make a big difference in the effectiveness of your instruction. There's really good data that shows this. And so I encourage you, whatever grade level you work with, to make sure that you have both concrete and virtual manipulatives available to your students so that they can more deeply understand the math that you're teaching. It results in such good gains that you were going to want to put those in play, but not just the fact that you get good gains. What's interesting is that when we use manipulatives, students' engagement levels increase, their motivation and their time on task increase. And of course, that in turn creates better results. But it's important to recognize that it also means that it supports our students in developing some understanding without us always being the provider of the information. When students learn on their own, when they figure it out on their own through manipulatives, then it becomes something that they really will value and use again and again. Now, there has to be an explicit instructional purpose for manipulatives, and students have to be taught how to use both concrete and virtual manipulatives. Otherwise, they become diversionary activities rather than instructional activities. So modeling, having students pair and talk together about how the concrete or the pictorial manipulatives that they used help them better understand, start to support that. In a Georgia public school classroom, I saw the difference that manipulatives made. Certainly, there was a level of conversation and discourse and questioning that went on. And I know that sometimes we prefer quiet classrooms, but that discourse was so valuable to students. And the manipulatives gave an opportunity for students to ask questions that they might have been embarrassed to ask before, to make observations that they might not have made before. And you saw a lot of student-student conversation. You certainly saw a teacher-student conversation too, but it was a very different learning experience. And almost every time I saw examples of higher order thinking incorporated. Certainly active engagement, lots of animation, lots of good discourse, lots of using mathematical language, lots of higher level thinking. And teachers certainly said that when the lessons included the use of manipulatives, they saw students applying what they had learned. They saw them asking many more questions, and the questions were higher order questions. And they saw students really making a leap to thinking about a more complex problem and connecting what they had learned to that. And students definitely learned from each other. There was a lot of peer learning that took place, the teachers said. Interestingly, they said that it had been a challenge to come up with manipulatives in the grades that didn't typically have manipulatives, and that they had found for themselves that was a barrier to instruction. In fact, they said that they had just gotten out of the habit of using manipulatives because they weren't available. Sometimes they didn't have enough of a particular manipulative, and so they just avoided their use. And they didn't feel like they had time or that they should have to make manipulatives or gather manipulatives, even though they knew substitutes were quite possible. So they found that virtual manipulatives became a great solution instead. And the other thing that they noted in that is that sometimes when concrete manipulatives were pulled out, their middle grade students thought of them as childish. So they found that they were more accepting of the use of concrete manipulatives. They said that for struggling students, there was much less frustration. For their strong students, much more open exploration. They saw a significant increase in fruitful discourse, and they saw that students understood fractions in a way they never had previously. So they very strongly believed that the use of manipulatives were important, and they thought that students benefited most when you started with concrete manipulatives, then moved to virtual, and then to the abstract, even though sometimes it was challenging to make concrete manipulatives available. So they said, regardless of the grade, that with initial instruction, they thought concrete manipulatives were a better use of manipulatives. And then as students started to acquire the concept, that use of virtual manipulatives moved them more quickly to mastery and provided reinforcement support for retention and full proficiency in the concept. And they also indicated that by having manipulatives, students were much better at learning with modeling. And they felt like that was a big transition for them to move from um, figuring out how to model and then using the models to learn that both of those were things that they were aiming for. And they found putting both in place pretty challenging for them. So we know that using manipulatives is very important for us instructionally. And we know we should have those in place. And I encourage you to think about how you might incorporate manipulatives as the teachers I described have. I want to talk a few minutes about assessment and the role assessment plays in making these shifts, and the role that assessment plays in helping students develop proficiency and be active math learners. We know that assessment's an integral part of teaching and learning. It's not the culmination of teaching and learning. And when we use assessment as an integral part of teaching and learning, we are most likely able as teachers and students to identify areas where understanding has um, taken place, and areas where misunderstanding is in play, and be able to build on that understanding to address the misunderstanding and to have learning result. And so assessment in that integral way makes a difference in student learning and is worth the investment of time. Now, I know we generally talk about pre-tests or pre-assessments or diagnostic assessments, formative assessments, interim assessments, and summative assessments in terms of a comprehensive assessment system. And when we think about these four types, and there are certainly other forms of assessment, but these are the primary forms of assessment that we use in service of learning. We want to make sure that we are shifting our assessment practices to embrace a more active and engaged learning process. And when we think about the research of William and others, we know that there's been real discussion around distinguishing among assessment of learning, for learning, and as learning. And we certainly want to think about not just assessment of learning. Our assessments give us a really good picture of where students are and where our supports need to be. And I encourage you not to abandon assessments. They play a valuable role in effective instruction when used appropriately. It's helpful to us to assess students at the beginning of the year and at other critical junctures to know where students are, to determine the pacing that we need to be putting in place, and to support students in the learning process. And it's certainly critical that we use formative assessment, and there's so many different ways that we can use formative assessment, and formative assessment is incredibly powerful. So on a daily basis, we want to really be engaged in that assessment process that informs what we do and also gives students concrete feedback that helps them own their own learning. We need to be using interim assessment in both formative and summative ways so that we are able to look at students' growth, understand more about the way our students learn, and monitor progress, but also to inform our instruction and make sure that students are aware of the progress they've made and where additional work needs to be done. And though summative assessment has really received a bad rap, we want to make sure that we put summative assessment in place in our classrooms, and that as we do that, we're giving students many different ways to demonstrate what they know. So thinking beyond that paper pencil approach that sometimes is the only way we've thought about assessment, and really think about ways for students to be able to transfer what they've learned to specific and real life tasks. So summative assessments, although certainly condemned in lots of different ways, if used appropriately and not overused, and if used in ways that move beyond our traditional approaches, can be quite valuable to us as educators and also quite valuable to our students and their families. So not just high stakes tests, but meaningful opportunities for us to look at students' achievement. And so assessment really does play a key role in helping students know where they are and also telling them about what they need to learn. And it gives them some concrete milestones to really think about as long as we describe the expected performance and are very explicit in the feedback that we provide so that students understand the data that assessments provide. And we look at process and operations, not just computations, and recognize that that information needs to be shared across the board. So we really want to provide opportunities for students to be able to focus not just on content, but on processes, and our assessments have to match that. And as I've described to you, that idea of active engagement, it's clear that that's more about process than product or content. All of those things need to be considered in our assessments, but not one over another. And so it's really important. When assessments are appropriate, students will be more motivated, more interested, and more engaged. And certainly high stakes assessments tend to be demotivating. And we know that assessments that are inappropriate are not good sources of motivation for our students. So we need high interest tasks to be incorporated in assessments, and we need data that students can use and be related to and see as relevant. And certainly we need to be aware of students' dispositions towards math and be able to analyze and assess that and address that, because students with out productive dispositions towards math are not going to be successful. And often those negative feelings about math are related to assessments and assessment tasks. Part of what we can do to help students be quite comfortable with our assessments is give them lots of exposure to the types of tasks that will be done. Of course, we want novel and non-routine tasks to be a part of our assessment opportunities, but giving students the skills and the resources so that they are ready for non-routine problems also makes a difference. And we certainly want students demonstrating their reasoning capabilities, their problem-solving capabilities, their communicating capabilities in the assessments that we do, so that we are able to change our instruction in tandem. If we are doing one kind of assessment and a totally different kind of instruction, then that sharp line results in poor instruction. And so we want to sort of blur that line and think about assessments that take on some instructional roles that are less formal and external. And I'm not saying that we don't include some of those types of assessment, but that we do a lot more assessing that's integrated into the classroom work and includes discourse and visiting problems and revisiting problems and being able to generalize and apply that information. And that really results in good information for the students and good information for us as teachers. In fact, with formative assessment, it's really helpful to think about observation, to think about a formative assessment approach that can't be distinguished from the learning process. And I know that that's certainly feasible for you. And I know that it's important for you to think about. So, moving away from those traditional rankings and ratings, not that they don't play a role, but that's less emphasized and more focus on using assessment in such a way that it helps students develop deep conceptual understanding and a productive disposition towards math. And it gives us the information we need to really look at students and be able to determine their strengths, their areas of concern, and support them, shifting away from just focusing on scores. And certainly we need data in a quick way to make adjustments, not lots of delays. That helps us change our teaching. When we shift our assessment, it actually reinforces those shifts in instruction, or and sometimes precipitates those shifts in instruction. So it helps us really focus on things like promoting higher order thinking and deeper understanding and developing student autonomy in their problem solving skills. So we want formative assessment in play in our classroom. It's well documented as making a change in students' outcomes. We want to be able to listen to our students to get insight into their thinking. We want to be observing. We want to be hearing students, and that all comes into play as support for our best practice instruction. When we are using the small group work and the paired work that students have as source for our formative assessments, we're going to see a great opportunity to support our students more effectively and to give them concrete feedback. And similarly, they'll be able to look at their own learning, identifying gaps in their own understanding. And that helps them when it's visible to them, not just us as teachers. So if we want our students actively engaged in the math learning process, developing in all aspects of mathematical proficiency, our instruction needs to continue to shift to support those best practices that will result in student proficiency and productive dispositions towards math. And our comprehensive assessment system needs to be married to that, support that, or if necessary, precipitate those changes. I hope that you have some great ideas about how we can move our instruction and our assessment practices to support our students. And I'm particularly interested in the changes that we can make in our assessments, moving away from the typical paper pencil to support our shifts. If you've got ideas, I hope that you'll share those ideas. We learn so well from each other, and it can make such a difference. If you have questions or if you have ideas to share, I hope that you will contact me. I've asked for you to spend some time reflecting on some of the things that I've talked about and some of the windows into classrooms that I've shared. And if you are going to make some changes or would like a partner or someone to check in with you on those things, I'd love to join you in that process. We can be a learning community together. Here's my contact information. I hope this has been helpful to you. Thank you so much for joining me.